You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Mark Thornton. He is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute and author of many books, including The Economics of Prohibition, which is also our topic for today. Mark, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Hey, Garrett. Great to be on with you.
So I'm going to approach this first question in a bit of a roundabout way. I live in Vancouver, and Vancouver has a serious problem with homelessness. There's a place called East Hastings where it's 2 solid blocks of homeless people, and you wouldn't want to be near there if you could possibly avoid it. So wherever you see homelessness and wherever you see poverty, at least in wealthy countries, you also see drugs and drug abuse. So I think to most normal people, they think that if you take the drugs out of that equation, you can solve the other problems as well, and therefore drugs should be illegal. So my question to you, Mark, is, where's the error in this line of reasoning?
Well, there's many errors in that context. The first thing is that homeless people are generally have mental problems and alcoholism, in addition to using drugs or being drug addicts. So, it's just that drugs just come along with that very bad combination of things. And of course, they're attracted to places where they can get handouts and where the weather isn't too bad and things of that nature. But if you make drugs legal, they're not going to be sold on the streets. They're going to be sold commercially in retail establishments and produced by legitimate companies using commercial methods of producing. So really, when you go from criminalization and prohibition to legalization and free markets, it's free markets that really clean up a lot of the problems that are associated with drug use. And notice I said associated with drug use because the problems are really caused by prohibition itself. So that when you have prohibition, you have inferior products on the marketplace. You have highly potent products. You have products where you don't know where the thing is coming from, and they're produced criminally. And so there's a criminal element that goes along with it, including a lot of violent crime that's necessary in their minds in order to protect their market, in order to enforce contracts. And so a lot of the things that are associated with drug use are really caused by prohibition itself. And so you can't clean up all of those social problems by making things illegal. That's the exact opposite of what's actually going on. So that criminalization or prohibition is really responsible for a large amount of crime, a large amount of criminalization, a large amount of people in prisons, as well as all of the overdose deaths that we're seeing both in Canada and in the United States, where the death tolls are rising year after year.
So you recently wrote an article titled The Legalization Cure for the Heroin Epidemic, which I'll link to at the show notes page, economicsdetective.com/drugs. Tell me, what was your argument in that article?
Well, it's a pretty complex argument to make. And so I'll try to do it as concisely as possible. One of the big contributing factors to the epidemic has been the fact that the medical industry is treating ordinary pain with opiates. So in the past, they used much less powerful painkillers that essentially did the job just fine. But pharmaceutical companies, special interest groups have been lobbying the government and the medical profession for many years to get the dosing increased to a higher level opiate. So Oxycontin and Vicodin are the 2 most noteworthy examples of that. And so doctors all across the country have been prescribing these powerful painkillers, which are addictive, for ordinary pain, such as broken arms and car accidents, building accidents, fishing accidents, all things like that. And so the use of these opiates has increased dramatically, and that's a problem because what happens is people have, say, a broken arm, they're given a prescription for pain with these opiates, they take the painkillers, they become addicted, and eventually they run out of their prescriptions, they're cut off and addicted. And so the first thing they do is they turn towards black market sales of Vicodin and Oxycontin. Even though they're legal, they're also sold in the black market. But in the black market, you have to pay $10, $15, $20, $25 a pill. And these addicts require multiple pills per day. And then to meet your addiction, you have to consume more pills over time. And so this gets incredibly expensive. And eventually, these addicts run out of money. They can't afford it. And so they're turning to a cheaper substitute, many cheaper substitutes, but primarily heroin. And so the face of the heroin addict has gone from the homeless junkie, urban junkie that you described earlier. And then in recent years, it's moved out into the suburbs and into the high schools. And more recently, in the last couple of years, it's moved out into rural areas. So places like Maine, places like Pennsylvania, places like New Hampshire, where people are engaged in the fishing industry, the lumber industry, the coal industry. And those people get hurt on a regular basis. It's not uncommon for coal miners to suffer injuries or people who are commercial fishermen to suffer injuries. And so they go to their doctor, the doc in the box, and they're given these potent opiates, such as Oxycontin and Vicodin. And eventually they end up down the road, as I explained, taking heroin. And the problem with heroin is not only is it dangerous, not only is it addictive, but the user doesn't really know how much they're consuming. So that heroin, as it comes into the country, is 100% pure. So you can get that kind of version, or you can get something that's been cut over and over again or diluted over and over again. It may be 10 or 15% potent once it reaches the retail consumer. And prices for this stuff are as low, if you buy in quantity, as low as $4. And so it's like 25% of the cost of getting a pill of Vicodin or Oxycontin. And so you've strung out these poor people, and now they're on the streets, criminalized and taking heroin, which marginalizes them socially. And then you create the situation where they don't know how much they're taking. And that's where a bulk of the overdose deaths are occurring, is as we push these poor people to the limit through no fault of their own, really. They're being played here by the pharmaceutical companies, the medical industry, and then, of course, the black markets. And it's just a terrible, terrible thing. And more people need to find out about what's going on here and what the rationale is for tens of thousands of people dying each year from heroin overdoses, not to mention all the emergency room visits, and then tens of thousands of people dying from the pharmaceuticals themselves, because they're, of course, very dangerous as well.
What's in it for the medical industry? I mean, you'd think they'd be in the business of making people healthy, not making them sick.
Well, the more and more you learn about the medical industry, the more you really have to question modern medical practices. How much good are they doing for their patients? And have they not been boxed in by these prescribing requirements and guidelines that have been set by the government, by Obamacare? And, for example, the advisory board for Obamacare has been asked to rewrite its prescribing guidelines concerning pain medication. But the many members of that committee are actually taking funds from, their doctors and their research doctors and they're taking funds from the pharmaceutical companies that make OxyContin and Vicodin. And so those doctors are basically setting the guidelines for all other doctors. And, so they don't even know necessarily what the problem is. They don't necessarily even know that their patients are dying, because that occurs months and months after they're seen by the doctor. And so they're disconnected with all this. They're told what to do. And it's very, very unfortunate that we have, in essence now, the federal government running how doctors will treat their patients. And so I don't think that the doctors themselves are getting any tremendous benefit out of this. They're just caught in a very unfortunate trap that's been set by the combination of the drug companies, medical researchers, and the government itself.
So how recent is this phenomenon? Is this just last decade or so?
Well, the incidence of people dying from OxyContin and Vicodin have been going on for quite a long time. And, with hundreds and then thousands and now tens of thousands of people. So it's been a building process. I know that the guidelines must have existed as of 4 years ago, because I had a minor medical problem. I went to a doc in the box. I was seen by a physician's assistant, and she came out with a prescription, which she gave to me, and said that it had been phoned into the pharmacy. And so I got back and took one of the pills, and then got up to get some water a few minutes later and felt very dizzy and unsure of my footing. So I went and checked the prescription, and sure enough, there it was, OxyContin, for a very minor medical problem with I wouldn't even consider it a pain problem. So, and then of course the heroin business part of it is, of course, there's been a lot more heroin coming into the United States for some reason since we went into Afghanistan. And so the amount of heroin coming in since then has gone up significantly, and the price of heroin has fallen to, I think, historic levels, not even adjusted for inflation. So it's been a building process. If you look at the statistics, it's been an upward climb for over a decade now.
Afghanistan grows a lot of poppies, right? Opium poppies. And is that the connection there?
Yeah, Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of poppies, which is where you get opium, and then it's just a short chemical leap to go from opium to morphine and heroin and other opiates, with opium forming the foundation of all that. And Afghanistan is one of the few places that's really good to grow opium. It's, of course, a vast country, impossible to police. And, of course, we've, completely destroyed the sort of infrastructure of society over there. And they're just trying to build their way back out. And beyond producing enough food for themselves, their only cash crop really is opium. And so they've been producing record amounts of that, and a lot of that, it gets back into the United States. It also goes, a great deal of it goes to Europe. And but there are many other places that are really good for growing that. Some of it is grown in South America and Central America, but Afghanistan has traditionally been the major source of it.
It's interesting that you mentioned Latin America. Netflix recently did a series called Narcos about Pablo Escobar, and it really opened my eyes to U.S. drug policy and how it's affected other countries, particularly Colombia. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the international aspects of the war on drugs.
Sure. When we look to Central and South America, we find countries, nations, governments, and societies are completely disrupted by our war on drugs. So that a lot of drugs are produced in South America and Central America. For Central America, it's cocaine and marijuana. For Central America, it's mostly marijuana. And we've cut off the sea routes and the air routes so that those drugs have to be brought up on land through Central America. And as a consequence, these drug cartels have established a transportation route that also involves buying off politicians, police, and militaries in those countries, or simply just threatening them. And so they have this conduit that they've established to transport drugs. And so we've seen really a breakdown of society in Central American countries like Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, all of these places. There are some places that are relatively free from this negative influence in the war on drugs, but a lot of the rural areas in particular, it's very violent. There's no law and order really. And, these drug cartels and kingpins like Escobar have really made life untenable. And that's why you see so many people from South America and Central America and Mexico fleeing into the United States. And they'd be perfectly happy to stay at home if, there wasn't so much violence, if they were able to have a job where there was foreign investment. But foreign investors aren't going to go into those places because they're just too dangerous and the government doesn't provide law and order at all. And so there's no jobs. Existence is very difficult and you're constantly under the threat of violence. And so, these people by and large are not benefiting. They're not getting revenues from the drug dealers and the drug cartels. There are a few people who serve as soldiers for these drug cartels, and they make money. They have a good existence, but for your average person, it's awful. And so last year you saw young kids even making a dangerous up to 1,500-mile journey on foot to try to get into the United States and find themselves a friend or a relative that had made it into the United States. It's just unbelievable what we've done to those poor people.
So if drugs were legal in the United States, the idea is that Walmart might start importing, safer versions of these and undercut the cartels. Is that sort of the idea?
Ultimately, that's where we want to go. So far, we've seen with Colorado legalizing marijuana that the marijuana growers near the Mexican border that would otherwise be transporting marijuana into the United States, they found that it's no longer profitable to grow marijuana. And so they've gone back to regular farming. But ultimately, legalization would eliminate the cartels, would eliminate the drug kingpins, and production would become commercial. And it would be large scale, like, for example, marijuana and cocaine would be large scale commercial operations, mostly near the equator. And that stuff would be, made under commercial conditions. And it would be sold in forms that weren't threatening to do harm to people. And as a consequence, most cocaine, for example, that was sold legally before the Harrison Narcotics Act was sold in highly diluted forms in various tonics. Coca-Cola was one of the big commercial outfits, and they had cocaine in Coca-Cola. But it would never kill you. You would have to drink way too much of it to even get a cocaine high off of it. And the sugar in Coca-Cola would kill you quicker than the cocaine would. And so, Walmart and other retailers would have to be very cognizant about negligence laws and, doing harm to their customers, making sure that children didn't have access to those products, or highly dangerous versions of those products. And so you'd get a great return to normalcy with legalization, and commercial production has many, many benefits over black market production. And you're also cleaning up the mess we've made in Central America somewhat, in South America somewhat, Afghanistan, Lebanon, all these places that have a comparative advantage in producing these illegal drugs. They would all see a lot of benefits there. We would see a lot of benefits here. We wouldn't be arresting and imprisoning hundreds of thousands of people for nonviolent crimes in the war on drugs. There'd be a reduction in property crime. There'd be a reduction in the collateral damage where people are killed, particularly in the inner city. And so the benefits of legalization just fan out in all directions. You get regular increase in jobs like we've seen in Colorado. So Colorado is a very small experiment, but all of the results that we've seen so far have been positive, or at least mildly positive. When you look at all sorts of social indicators, there is a report out there that claims that Colorado is, a nightmare and that all sorts of problems are coming up. But the group that did that is basically paid by the White House to write misleading reports about legalization. And I, studied their report and found that all of their methodologies that I investigated were basically misleading, and they were, clearly cooking the books for the White House to try to make Colorado not seem like the victory it is. And, a lot of people who oppose legalization in Colorado have now admitted that they were wrong and that they wouldn't vote to re-legalize marijuana based on their experience. And, people have to go by their experience, but economic theory can tell us a lot about all these things and how they're going to turn out, and why legalization is not going to be a nightmare, and why it has so many peripheral benefits that it's hard to list them all, either in one interview or one book or one article. But I think it's pretty clear. And Portugal provides another excellent example of why liberalization of these otherwise dangerous drugs can be beneficial.
I remember reading your critique of that Colorado report, that some of the claims were doubling in the number of people driving under the influence of marijuana. Could you address that particular claim?
Well, there was a lot of them, and I'm not even sure what the problem there was. But another example was, they said that the number of problems in high schools involving illegal drugs had increased by, I think, 15%. And but of course, they didn't even have hard numbers with respect to marijuana, so they can't really even say if it was marijuana or some other drug that is still illegal. But I went back and looked, and over that time span, the number of students in Colorado high schools had increased by something like 30%. So if you get a 15% increase in the problem, but a 30% increase in the number of students, well, you've actually reduced the overall relative level of drug problems in high schools. But they left that out. They left out something very simple, something that any research report would consider including in the analysis.
Right. And once they've sort of fudged the numbers a bit in one or two areas, you sort of start to not believe the other claims they're making.
Yeah, I think I looked at 3 or 4 claims, and all of them were intentionally biased to give you a negative view of legalization. And when you do some normal adjustments and take into consider normal things that any social science researcher would take into consideration, you find out that it's just propaganda. They're just making it up, and they're not being scientific. They're just creating some useful propaganda for the government itself.
So earlier you mentioned the Harrison Narcotics Act. Most people alive today aren't old enough to remember a time before the criminalization of drugs. So it's kind of easy to just assume that things were always this way. But can you give a little background about how we got from, marijuana having been cultivated and consumed legally for thousands of years to the state we're in now?
Well, there's always been some kind of trouble with drugs. Except with marijuana, nobody's ever overdosed on natural marijuana, or really had much of a problem with natural marijuana. These things have been consumed. Marijuana, opium, and hashish, and so forth have been consumed for thousands of years, and there was, some problems with some of these drugs. There was addiction to opiates prior to them being made illegal. So I'm not going to deny that there were no problems. But by and large, there was no mass hysteria. There was no public uproar against any of these drugs. And so we have two laws, basically, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 and the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Both of these laws were based on the government's power to tax. But with the Harrison Narcotics Act, they took that power to tax, and they basically created a prohibition by making the tax prohibitively high. And they also made the medical profession's approach to opiate addiction illegal. So you could not put an opium or heroin addict on a maintenance withdrawal type dosage. So they in essence turned this tax and control aspect. They wanted to know, how many people were using this stuff. And so they used the tax to get the information, but then they quickly turned that into a prohibition of the drug and a prohibition against the medical profession's accepted practice of maintenance dosing of addicts in an attempt to get them to withdraw slowly over time. And so, like I said, there was no public uproar. There was no, call to arms. It was just they snuck this thing through for considerations of foreign policy and the need of some of our political leaders to become important on the international stage. And as we get to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, very similar thing. The government was passed in considered constitutional that the government has the right to tax. And so they used that, and then they quickly converted that into a prohibition where, they basically made the tax prohibitively high and basically wouldn't allow anybody to use it, to gain access to it. And again, marijuana was something that had been used. It's something that the medical profession relied on. My father was a pharmacist, and he had a lot of antique equipment in his pharmacy, including 2 large jars for cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, the 2 main strains of marijuana. And it was used in a variety of different applications, including for pain. There was an empty bottle of horse liniment in his collection, and what they would do is use the liniment on horses. They started with, when horses were used on farms, and then race horses as well. And of course, so this is an obvious application. The horses are not getting high, and the farmers and the racetracks obviously see a benefit. of putting this liniment on horses' legs, and but they made it illegal. It really wasn't. There was no real public uproar against marijuana at the time. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics had put out a lot of propaganda to try to support this move. They made it. They were basically just telling lies. The Commissioner Anslinger got up before Congress and said that marijuana makes you insane, turns you into a killer, and then kills you. Kills you. And someone from the medical profession testified next and said that this is all completely untrue, that it doesn't drive you insane, that it doesn't make you a murderer or a rapist, and it doesn't kill you. And that very day is when Harry Anslinger, the commissioner, made up the gateway theory of drugs on the spot. And so he said, well, maybe I was telling a lie. Maybe none of that is true. But if you smoke marijuana, you'll eventually become a heroin addict, and then you'll be a killer and a rapist and so on and so forth, which of course is also not true. But it was enough of a smokescreen for Congress to pass that Marijuana Tax Act. The medical profession got up in front of Congress. The Veterinary Association got up in front of Congress and all testified against that legislation, as well as others, the pharmaceutical, the pharmacist lobby, all of that. But with Anslinger's gateway theory and rape and murder and insanity carried the day. And the laws, of course, have only gotten tougher. We're spending more and more money. Marijuana is classified as a class 1 drug, which means it's supposed to be the same as heroin and cocaine, which is ridiculous. And it's only been in the last 10 years or so when clearer minds have spoken up and against these very disastrous prohibitions that are completely unnecessary.
There's an old quote from one of President Richard Nixon's advisors, John Ehrlichman, which has recently been dug up and been circulating around the internet. I'll read it in full. "You want to know what this was really all about?" Ehrlichman said to the reporter. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So I want to ask, are you familiar with that quote?
I have heard that. I've never read it, but of course, dirty tricks was what Richard Nixon was all about, including Watergate in that first term of his, and then in the second term, as far as it lasted. Part of that goes back to the 1960 campaign between Nixon and Kennedy. And Kennedy and his father employed all these dirty tricks, or his brother, employed all these dirty tricks to in essence, steal the election from Nixon. So Nixon vowed that he was going to use anything under the sun to get into power and to maintain power in his leadership position. But these allusions to African Americans and Mexican Americans, black jazz musicians in New Orleans, these have gone back for a very long time. And it's just a way of using bigotry to get your point of view and to get more power. So you marginalize minority groups in your rhetoric. And of course, they've also marginalized minority groups in practice, so that the war on drugs has fallen disproportionately heavy on African Americans, Hispanic Americans, of various sorts. And so they make up a highly disproportionate share of the prison population. And this is something that is it's a terrible thing, and it's really crushing, particularly urban minority groups, because basically the breadwinner in the family is in prison for smoking pot, and then later on has all sorts of legal disabilities with respect to getting and maintaining a job, getting to work, getting loans, college student loans. There are so many disabilities once you get out of prison that very often you end up back in prison. And so it's a vicious cycle, and a lot of this is driven by the war on drugs, and with this added, ever-present role of bigotry. And of course, that goes back to the American Indians, Native Americans, where they were always trying to keep it illegal to sell alcohol and guns to Native Americans. And so there's a strong, long pattern of bigotry between with respect to prohibitions of all different sorts, and it's just disgraceful.
I'm reminded of a story in Canadian history where the push to criminalize opium was driven by moral panic about Chinese immigrants in the early 20th century, I believe. There's a certain inconsistency in a lot of these laws. For instance, marijuana is illegal, but alcohol arguably has worse health and social effects. And something like crystal meth is considered to be, the worst possible drug, and yet Adderall, which is chemically very similar, is something we give to our kids if they can't pay attention in school. So, why are we so inconsistent when it comes to our attitudes toward these substances?
Yeah, well, that's politics, and that's democracy in action there for you. As you're absolutely correct that those are two glaring inconsistencies. Marijuana, as I said, is not deadly. There are very few people who show up in emergency rooms that are taking natural marijuana that have medical problems, and it's actually a better medicine in many respects than a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, their products. And that's maybe part of the problem, is that pharmaceuticals companies see that you can produce massive amounts of marijuana without any chemicals at a very low cost, and you can genetically engineer marijuana so that it can address all sorts of medical issues. So we all know that marijuana is good for treating things like cancer, HIV/AIDS, things of that nature, because it has the properties that relieve pain, improve appetite, make it easier to sleep and to stay asleep. And those are the three ingredients that make people better. Okay, so you can eat, you can drink, you're not in pain, you get to sleep. That's the number one prescription for getting better from just about anything. Or at least it will keep you alive for a lot longer and under better circumstances, i.e. without pain. But we've also come to realize that various forms of marijuana can treat, at least this is indicated by current research, things like certain types of brain tumors, certain types of blood cancers, and there's new things coming out every day that people are researching marijuana and finding it's a very valuable product, whereas you really can't say much positive about alcohol consumption or tobacco consumption. I mean, there are a few minor things that medical researchers can point to, but nothing compared to the health benefits of medical marijuana. And so it's just a tremendous inconsistency, but we're in a much better place now than we were when I started working on this back in around the mid 1980s, when the war on drugs was going full tilt, and we're pressing even higher in terms of budgets and in terms of legal penalties and in terms of bringing the military into the fight and bringing international cooperation to bear on the war on drugs. And so I think, fortunately, with so many things in a state of chaos in modern society, we're actually moving in a positive direction with respect to the war on drugs. And I think the United Nations is set to release a new protocol with respect to the war on drugs very soon. And it's my belief that, based on what my sources internationally are telling me, that they're going to rewrite those protocols so that countries can engage in more liberal policies that reduce the harm to drug users in society, along the lines that Portugal has adopted since the 1990s, and which Ireland is set to adopt, I believe, very shortly.
Yeah, Vancouver, it's not, marijuana in Vancouver is not fully legalized, but what we have is sort of a gray market where there's an implicit understanding between our marijuana sellers and police that you can open up a marijuana dispensary, and so long as you pay your taxes and don't sell to kids, then you can operate sort of with a nod from the law, even if it's not literally legal. So, and I think we've seen a lot of the, society has not collapsed.
Yes, and this has happened. In addition to the states of Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, in Washington, D.C., there are other towns and cities where the mayor and the city council have gone to the chief of police and they've said, look, we want you to make marijuana the lowest priority of your police department. We don't want anybody in jail. We don't want people going through the legal system just for marijuana consumption. And so, for example, the city of Philadelphia adopted this policy and saved several millions of dollars with respect to jails, prisons, police time and effort, and lawyers, and so on, to prosecute these cases. And so more and more places are turning to this. There's one city in the state of Maine where they're having this big problem with heroin. And, this little fishing village, idyllic fishing village on the coast of Maine, people were turning up dead from heroin overdoses on a very regular basis. And the police chief just decided on his own that he was going to not arrest anybody, and that he was going to put out an offer that he would be willing to help people under these circumstances get the resources that they needed to stay healthy and eventually to get off of these drugs. And also that all of his officers carried the stimulant that if you're suffering from a heroin overdose, the officer can administer the stimulant and get you breathing again and save your life. And so they've adopted a harm reduction policy and a more positive approach where they're using a medicalization approach rather than a criminalization approach. And they're using social services and volunteers and things of that nature to stop the killing and to start the healing.
Yeah, that's just great. I was going to mention, you listed a bunch of potential health benefits of marijuana, and one other one that I've heard about is use of concentrated THC to treat epilepsy. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, there's a certain kind of epilepsy, the seizures that are not common, but do occur in little children, where they have hundreds of these seizures every day, and modern medicine doesn't have anything to offer these poor children. And the seizures come so often that it's very difficult for them to even eat and to keep food down. And they get hurt and injured as a result of these seizures. And of course, the parents are obviously devastated by all this. You can imagine a poor young 3 or 4 year old girl or boy going through this, and the parents not being able to do anything to help them, the medical profession offering almost nothing to help them. But we do now know, based on a small sample, that cannabis concentrated, I think it's either an oil or something that they can ingest, and it's not THC. THC is the chemical element that gets you high or gets you stoned. If it's potent enough, you'll get stoned, rather than the old 1960s, 70s marijuana, which got you high. The 1990s to the present marijuana generally gets you stoned because it's so much more potent now than it used to be, hundreds of times more potent. But in any case, there's another variety of marijuana chemical called CBD. And CBD does not get you high, but it still has a chemical effect. And basically, THC, CBD gets into your body, and it bonds with receptors, most notably in your brain, but in other places of your body as well. We have these receptors, and these two chemicals bond with those receptors, and in the case of THC, get you high, and in the case of CBD, it has a different effect. It has a calming effect, and it almost completely eliminates these epileptic seizures in small children. So it's a wonderful thing, and it's still illegal, even though it doesn't get you high. As a matter of fact, hemp, which is related to cannabis and marijuana, doesn't have any THC in it, and it's also illegal. So talk about an irrational law and program. Hemp is the industrial form of marijuana that can be used to make textiles and rope and all sorts of things. But it's still illegal as well. So we're finding, like for these seizures, medical researchers are finding stuff that marijuana is helpful for or curative of all sorts of medical maladies. And other people are working on the idea that maybe we should substitute a pharmaceutical version of THC or CBD or some combination that would be better than a lot of other pharmaceutical products which have dangerous side effects. So psychoactive drugs, for example, that are meant to calm you down, clear you up, and so forth, very, very dangerous, especially for young adults, never tested on young adults. And we're seeing all these problems in schools and high schools and colleges with people on those psychoactive drugs. And obviously, medical marijuana tailored for those particular uses might be incredibly helpful and be better, be better in terms of effectiveness, be better in terms of fewer adverse side effects, and of course, cost as well.
You mentioned marijuana being 10 times as potent, or many times more potent than it once was. How does that relate to the war on drugs?
Well, that's the core of my dissertation and my book, The Economics of Prohibition. And basically, it's an application of the Alchian-Allen effect to drugs. And so if you take a highly potent version of marijuana and a very low potent version of marijuana, and you put a tax on both of them the same, or you put a transportation cost on both of them that's the same, or if you produce a war on drugs risk factor on both of them, what happens is that people will, if you put a tax on two products, people will buy a higher octane gasoline. If you put a transportation on low quality and high quality apples, people will export more high quality apples. And when you put a risk of prohibition on drug smugglers, they're going to smuggle in the highly potent version rather than the low potent version because they can pack more punch in a smaller container, more bang for your buck, so to speak. And so as the war on drugs really heated up in the early 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, we saw the potency rise from less than 0.5% in the early 70s to 4% in the mid 1980s. Nowadays, it's more like about 10%. So the potency of marijuana, through better growing, better processing procedures, and even genetic engineering by drug growers, marijuana growers, we've seen the potency rise as a way to avoid the risks of drug smuggling.
So the higher value per weight items are less risky and so more profitable, is what you're saying.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. And of course, it at some point becomes very difficult to increase the potency of marijuana. And so drug smugglers have switched to bringing in more cocaine and more heroin, as we were discussing earlier. It's just that you can pack so many more doses of something like heroin into a suitcase than you can with marijuana. And so this pushes the entire market in the direction of more potent, more dangerous drugs, more addictive drugs, and away from the safer, less addictive, less harmful drugs. And so the whole purpose of prohibition is undermined with that single insight.
So, final question. So in addition to the impacts on consumers, there's the issue of the sellers in these black markets. A lot of smart people, but non-economists mostly, want to institute $15 minimum wages like they have in California, and they want to ban things like Uber. And the problem is that these policies block off opportunities for people who fall through the cracks of, formal education, high school dropouts, and, people with maybe mental health issues and such. And by doing that, they lower the opportunity cost of entering the illicit drug trade. So talk a little bit about the impact of the war on drugs on the dealers themselves and the poor people who enter this business.
Yes, it is a lot of disadvantaged people who don't have much of a formal education. People find themselves in the war ground of urban America. People with a criminal record. These are, disadvantaged people by and large. And so the dealers really are not very well advantaged here. And either they quickly get out of the business or they find themselves in jail. And so the war on drugs does not really benefit the retail distribution, the people involved in retail distribution. As a matter of fact, there was a study many years ago about drug dealers in Washington, D.C., and the economists who did the study found that, in effect, the street dealers were making roughly the minimum wage at the time. I think it was like $5 an hour. And so they're not the ones that are benefiting here. Those are the ones that are absorbing most of the losses. These are the people who are being killed in street fights and shootouts. So they're leading a very dangerous, marginal life, and they're not really making tons of money. And so most of them end up either dead or in jail within a few years. It's the drug kingpins who organize this effort and get the drugs into the country and get them to the retail level. Those are the ones that are making all the money. Of course, they lead a dangerous life too, and they are subject to arrest and so on and so forth. But these are the people who have roomfuls of American $100 bills, gold, precious stones, and a military like protective wing to their operations. So it's not helping your local street dealer at all. It's helping the drug kingpins, and it's helping American politicians who get lots of bribes, not necessarily from the drug kingpins themselves, but from pharmaceutical companies and alcohol distribution companies and cigarette manufacturers. These are all the interest groups that are donating money to other groups to oppose drug legalization. So if you dig deep enough, these groups that oppose ending the war on drugs, they seem to be religious or family oriented or whatever. But if you look at where the money ultimately comes from, you'll find that it's alcohol companies, tobacco companies, and pharmaceutical companies.
Do you have any parting thoughts?
Well, the great thing for me is, in terms of talking about the war on drugs, is it's very near and dear to my heart. I've been working on it for a very long time, and it's one area where we're actually winning. We're not making any progress in terms of the Federal Reserve or Social Security, the national debt, or all of these horrendous other economic problems. But with the war on drugs, we're actually we're starting to make a real tangible difference. And I can send you, for your audience, a PDF copy of my book, The Economics of Prohibition. That'll give you some flavor for how much progress we've actually made.
We'll link to that on the show notes page, economicsdetective.com/drugs. Mark Thornton, thanks for being on Economics Detective Radio.
Garrett, it's been a real pleasure. Love doing the interview with you.
If you enjoyed that episode of Economics Detective Radio, head over to the show notes page, economicsdetective.com/drugs. And if you really liked that episode, then maybe you'd consider supporting the podcast. There's at least 3 great ways to do it. The first is to support me directly through my Patreon page. You can find a link at economicsdetective.com/support. Patreon is a service that allows you to make small, recurring donations to content creators who produce free content that you enjoy, such as this podcast. I appreciate that quite a bit. It's a real motivating factor for me, and I do offer some bonus content. I call them my afterthoughts episodes, that a little while after making each episode, I'll record an extra 10 to 15 minutes of just my thoughts on the issue or on related issues. And I release that on my Patreon page to my supporters or patrons. The other ways, of course, are to write a kind review on iTunes or Stitcher. Reviews really help the show grow and find an audience. A lot of people will not subscribe to a podcast if it doesn't have very many reviews, especially on iTunes. And you write reviews, and then more people come, and it's totally free for you and really helps the show, and I really appreciate it. The third way is to, again, through economicsdetective.com/support, you can find some affiliate links. I'm part of the Amazon affiliate program, and you can go to that page and click through the Amazon banner, and I get a small commission on any purchases you make thereafter. I believe it's 4%, and there's no additional cost to you. So if you're planning on making an Amazon purchase today, maybe add a few extra clicks to your path to get there, and you'll be able to support the show while you do it. I'm also part of a new affiliate program, libertyclassroom.com, where Tom Woods, a fairly well-known libertarian historian, has set up a set of online courses to teach history and economics from a libertarian perspective. I believe the content is very high quality, and I think a lot of the people who listen to this podcast would enjoy that. So if that's you, head on over to economicsdetective.com/support. And if you're still with me, thanks.